Welcome back to this session. We're going to look at the 19th century and what God was doing in Scotland in that time. As I mentioned in the previous session, the 18th century saw a movement of God through Wesley and Whitefield, but it was not the big movement that they had hoped for at the time. This would happen in the 19th century. Between 1839 and 1910, Scotland saw a huge Christian movement that transformed this nation. It was in this time that Scotland became known as the land of the book, the land of the Bible. Miraculous revival movements were instrumental in this process. What began with the transformation of individuals led to the transformation of communities and the nation itself. But what is revival? The Reverend Duncan Campbell was formerly the principal of the Faith Mission Bible College in Edinburgh. He experienced a genuine revival movement in the Hebrides between 1949 and 1951. He said that revival is a community saturated with God. It is when the hearts of individual Christians and churches are purified from sin and surrendered to Christ as Lord. This then causes an awakening of the local unbelieving population who become God-conscious and deeply convicted of sin, leading to many genuine, lasting conversions. Scotland has had more revivals than any country in the world. Revival always begins with believing, persevering, humble and obedient hearts. People who call out to God in prayer. They have a passion for prayer, and God responds as they are broken and humble to respond to their heart cries. The first revival was 1839. This is the first wave. On the 23rd of July 1839, something extraordinary happened in a Presbyterian church in Kilsyth. William Chalmers Burns, who had been converted to Christ in Edinburgh, was preaching to the packed congregation. The people listened attentively to him as he spoke of his Saviour, but then it was like a spiritual dam burst, with a sudden outpouring of weeping and wailing and groaning, and also shouts of praise from some of the Christians there. Burns wrote in his memoir, "The appearance of a great part of the people from the pulpit gave me an awfully vivid picture of the state of the ungodly in the day of Christ's coming to judgment. Some were screaming out in agony, others, and among these strong men, fell to the ground as if they had been dead." From that time on, it was a topic of conversation in the town. Daily services were held in the church, and hundreds would gather for morning prayers in the market square. Crowds began to come to Kilsyth to find out what on earth was happening. Later, an open-air communion service was held in September with an estimated number of between 12,000 to 15,000 people. The phenomenon occurred in other churches in town. In response to the message of the gospel among the Methodists, 40 or 50 stout, able-bodied persons fell to the ground as if dead. On being removed to a house and recovering themselves, they all cried out to God for mercy. It is not that there was some sort of psychological manipulation going on. There was no use of sensational music or emotional preaching to whip up the crowds. Burns spoke about a sweet melting of heart among the audience, and many of the unconverted were weeping bitterly aloud. Although, he says, "I spoke throughout with perfect calmness and solemnity." When Dr. Thomas Guthrie went to Kilsyth to investigate what was happening and report back to the churches in Edinburgh, he wrote, "The difficulty at Kilsyth is not, as here, how to get people to church, but the difficulty has almost been how to keep them away from it so that the common business of life might not be neglected." This revival movement broke out in different parts of Scotland, such as Dundee, Perth and Leith. The disruption of the Free Church of Scotland in 1843 was also a key part of what was going on in this time. One of the consequences of the 1839 revival was this disruption. For 131 years, the Church of Scotland had settled in a compromised position since the 1712 Patronage Act, which allowed the local landowner to choose the pastor and defied the Presbyterian Democratic Reformation Constitution of 1560, which had enshrined the Christian democratic right of the people in choosing their leaders. By 1833, Dr. Thomas Chalmers was leading the evangelical dissenters in the General Assembly. He did not mince his words, for the patron, he said, might be an infidel or an atheist, a fool or a knave, a scoundrel to society and a foe to godliness. But because he had bought or inherited a certain civil right, he has the chief power in the selection of the man who is to minister in holy things to a Christian congregation. Well, the evangelicals tried unsuccessfully to veto the General Assembly, but eventually procured a majority vote of 46 in 1834. This was a key moment. However, the civil courts opposed the democratic right of the Presbyterians. Boxed into a corner after exhausting all diplomatic means, it was believed that the only way to be obedient to their Reformation constitution was to leave the Church of Scotland. And so, the Free Church of Scotland was born in 1843. It was called the Disruption because over 30% of the pastors, that's 474 of them, left the Church of Scotland, and all of the missionaries except for one. They had to leave behind their houses, salaries, and church buildings. There was an incredible sacrificial movement to finance their ministers and building new churches. There were 700 churches built in the first 10 years. And also to provide accommodation for the ministers, as well as to build 500 new schools, giving an education to 47,000 children. The Free Church was a leading denomination in the 19th century revival movements. This led to the popular ditty of the time: "The free kirk is the wee kirk, the kirk without the steeple. The old kirk is the cold kirk, the kirk without the people." The second wave of revival broke out in Scotland between 1859 and 1861. Reports of revival breaking out in New York in America in 1857 and in Kells, Northern Ireland in 1859 stirred serious Christians to seek God in prayer for another revival in Scotland. The Scottish revival seems to have broken out first in Glasgow, when John Horner came from the Coleraine revival to preach at the Religious Institution Rooms in Glasgow on the 24th of July 1859. The congregation began to experience what was happening in Ulster and in America. According to the Scottish Guardian, scores of people were in great distress and many were seen weeping. In less than a week, daily meetings were being held in the Religious Institution Rooms, but as the crowds kept coming, they had to find a bigger venue. The Trades Hall also became too small, so that the hungry masses had to meet in different large buildings in the city, even in the open air. In close conjunction with the Religious Institution Rooms was the Wynd Free Church, which soon became a centre of the revival in Scotland. Despite the cautious nature of most of the Free Church people and ministers, who tried to suppress the emotionalism as much as possible, God's Spirit was being poured out on the people, usually with scenes similar to that of previous revivals. It is a remarkable fact that the Free Church was right at the heart of the movement, witnessing the transformation of many churchgoers and the conversion of thousands. On the 19th of August, 1860, a crowd of thousands gathered to hear the preaching on Glasgow Green, where they witnessed similar scenes to the famous Cambuslang revival of George Whitefield in 1742. Richard Weaver, one of the evangelists there, said that the Spirit came in such power that many were struck down under the word and had to be carried into a neighbouring church, and there they lay on the floor as if dead. This extraordinary spiritual fire broke out almost everywhere in Scotland, leaving in its wake many thousands of transformed lives. Often the scoffers would go to mock and end up encountering God for themselves, leaving them humbled, repentant, and broken. Often they would be raised up to preach effectively throughout their local districts and beyond. The alcoholics and the profligates were being changed. The worst of sinners were becoming saints. In Argyll and the Western Isles, there was a particularly extraordinary transformation, with many churches doubling, tripling, and even quadrupling within months. In the Reverend Cameron's church in Kilcommon on Islay, his congregation exploded rapidly from 60 to 900, regularly attending the daily prayer meeting. In Campbelltown, the Free Church minister reported that the prayer meeting that used to have about a dozen people and which had ceased altogether, now attracted 400 to 500 prayer people. Such accounts were being reproduced in many parts of Scotland, and for the most part the converted people remained in the churches for a long time. The third wave broke out in Scotland in 1873 and continued into the 1880s. This was the revival of D.L. Moody, who came from Chicago. The ground in Scotland was very well prepared when D.L. Moody, the evangelist, came to preach. The usual working of this revival was that it impacted every class of people, from the poor right up to the well-to-do, professors, national leaders, and especially university students. The monthly visitor tract distributed to most of Scotland and circulated to every family in the city covered the 1873 to 1874 revival with gushing words of enthusiasm. "What do you think of it?" was a common saying in Edinburgh when 6 months ago this gracious work was beginning. Few who believe in conversion ask that question now. All classes, the rich and the poor, lawyers, doctors, soldiers, students, merchants, artisans, boys and girls at school, are enlisting for Christ. Men of the world, drunkards and blasphemers, infidels, the very chief of sinners, are pressing into the kingdom. Truly Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. Go where you will hear people speaking of salvation, and no one wonders. Another report was equally fascinating, as it recalls that for all the month of December, nothing else was spoken of in Edinburgh. The work, the meetings, and the men were spoken of at breakfast, at dinner, on the streets, and even in the ballrooms. What does it all mean? What is this all about? At certain hours there seemed to be no one in Princes Street who did not carry a hymn book. The tramway cars were full of hymn books, and often it happened that nearly everyone in them was interested in the same subject, and pleasant Christian fellowship was exchanged. One of the key things that came out of this third wave of revival was an extraordinary church unity. The gospel unity amongst the evangelicals was such that Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists and Independents and Episcopalians worked together for the huge harvest which came. Regular open-air preaching in places like Edinburgh attracted crowds of between 10,000 and 15,000. The gospel preachers were ministers from different churches who took it in turns to preach. One of the important aspects we need to look at is about the fruit. Was this just a flash in a pan, a sort of a straw revival, or was it something that deeply impacted our culture and left good long-lasting fruit? One of the pioneers on a scholarly appraisal of revival was J. Edwin Orr, whose thesis for a PhD at the University of Oxford was on the Second Evangelical Awakening in Britain. He claimed that out of a population in Scotland in 1859 to 61, of over 3 million people, there were about 300,000 converts, or about 10% of the population. Although it is clear that a great transformation on a large scale occurred, Tom Lenny points out that Orr missed some important considerations in his calculations, but he admits that the number of converts from the 1859 to 61 revival in Scotland remains unknown and completely unverifiable, but it is universally considered to have run into at least numerous tens of thousands. In the Free Church, for example, 477 churches recorded over 15,000 new members in 1859 alone, and the usual attendance at these churches was recorded at an increase of over 50% for many years after that. Alcoholic addiction decreased between 1859 and 1864 by 55% in Edinburgh, and crime was noticeably reduced wherever the revival went. In villages like Ferryden and Cellardike, the fruit of the revival made a huge difference to the communities, with almost all of those converted in the movement being faithful Christians 29 years later, as was recorded. George Gardner of Banff wrote about the long-term positive change that came over the towns in the northeast of Scotland, for he says the whole face of society in those villages is so changed that those who have known them before are struck with wonder. Matthews claims that all the mission movements, home, foreign, philanthropic schemes and measures for the alleviation of human suffering have been mainly manned and maintained by the converts of the revival of 1859 and the 60s and those who sympathised with it.